Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's webinar series to discuss infant formula, food ingredients, and packaging requirements. I'm Lieutenant Commander Janisha Robbs with the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Communications, and Public Engagement staff, and today I'll serve as your moderator. Today's webinar will focus on regulatory requirements and considerations for infant formula ingredients. The FDA plays a critical role in ensuring the safety and nutritional adequacy of infant formula in the United States. The FDA also works to ensure that infant formula sold in the United States meets the required safety and nutritional standards specified in Section 412 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and in the FDA's implementing regulations at 21 CFR Parts 106 and 107. The webinars in this series are part of the FDA's ongoing efforts to help improve the safety and resilience of the U.S. infant formula supply and provide educational resources for infant formula manufacturers. In a moment, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, to provide opening remarks. Then you will hear from Dr. Rachel Morissette, Regulatory Review Scientist in the CFSAN's Office of Food Additive Safety, Division of Food Ingredients, to provide information on U.S. regulation of food ingredients and considerations for infant formula. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the webinar, where Dr. Morissette will answer questions we've received through the registration process. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling.
Thank you, Janisha, and welcome everyone. Welcome back for many to the fifth webinar in this series. As Janisha noted in this webinar, Dr. Rachel Morissette, a regulatory review scientist and biochemist in CFSAN's Office of Food Additive Safety, will provide you with important information on FDA's requirements and recommendations regarding infant formula ingredient safety. As I mentioned in the previous webinars, and many will no doubt be tired of hearing me say it, but it is important, and so I will repeat it. The requirements for new infant formula submissions are the same, whether a manufacturer and its products are eligible to pursue the path outlined in our infant formula transition plan guidance, published in September of 2022, or a manufacturer is making a new infant formula submission through our regular established process. This includes the ingredient safety requirements. In the second webinar in this series, Dr. Carrie Assar of our infant formula and medical food staff provided an overview of the entire landscape of FDA's new infant formula submission requirements and recommendations. You may find it helpful to view that webinar again as a refresher after this one. Today, Dr. Morissette will take us on a deeper dive into FDA's requirements and recommendations regarding infant formula ingredient safety, including important legal and regulatory context on food ingredient safety generally. We hope that all of you, regardless of the pathway you may be on and whatever your role might be in the process, will find this core information to be helpful. I will note the information in this webinar may be especially useful to those involved in product formulation and regulatory affairs. And now, to turn things over to Dr. Morissette.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. My name is Dr. Rachel Morissette, and I am a biochemist and regulatory review scientist for the Office of Food Additive Safety in the Division of Food Ingredients. Today, I will be giving an overview of how food ingredients, including those used in infant formula, are regulated in the U.S. The regulation of substances added to food in the U.S. has a long and complex history, which has led to robust regulatory standards that rely on multiple elements to reach a conclusion of safe use. Today, I hope to clarify some of this for you by breaking down that complexity and providing some practical information on the U.S.'s food ingredient regulatory framework. I'll begin by giving an overview of the law and how we ended up with our current regulatory system. Next, I'll discuss the food additive definition and GRAS, or generally recognized as safe provision, and we'll discuss how they are similar and different. Finally, I'll focus on FDA's pre-market ingredient programs, including the food additive petition process and the GRAS notification program with a focus on how FDA evaluates GRAS notices. I'll end on some special considerations for ingredients intended for use in infant formula. Let's start with some history. I should note that we often use GRAS ingredient and GRAS substance interchangeably, as you'll see throughout. Around the turn of the 20th century, journalists had exposed in vivid detail the hazards of the marketplace at that time. In fact, the nauseating condition of the meatpacking industry that Upton St. Clair captured in his book, The Jungle, was the final precipitating force behind both a meat inspection law and a comprehensive food and drug law. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Food and Drugs Act, which prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs in interstate commerce, and laid a foundation for the nation's first consumer protection agency, the Food and Drug Administration. In 1937, a new sulfa drug marketed for children led to the death of 100 patients. This therapeutic disaster led to President Franklin Roosevelt signing the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The 1938 FD&C Act gave FDA the legal authority to regulate drugs, cosmetics, food, and food ingredients, and the authority to oversee the safety of our food supply. Additionally, it is this act that provides the framework for assuring the safety of substances added to food. This framework is described in the 1958 Food Additives Amendment to the Act, which was passed by Congress in response to concerns about the safety of new food ingredients. It is this amendment that defines both food additives and GRAS substances. Additionally, there was now a requirement for pre-market approval of food additives. This amendment also established a standard of review, standard of safety, and formal rulemaking procedures for both food additives and GRAS affirmation petitions. In 1960, the Color Additives Amendment to the Act established pre-market approval requirements for color additives and a process for submitting color additive petitions. To fulfill the provisions of U.S. law under the FD&C Act, also referred to as the Act, the FDA develops, publishes, and implements regulations. Proposed and final rules are first published in the Federal Register. Then the resulting regulations are published in the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. Food regulations are primarily located in Title 21 of the CFR. In addition to the statute, which is the FD&C Act for us, and which gives FDA the authority to establish regulations and rules for its regulatory programs found in the CFR, FDA also issues guidance documents to assist stakeholders. These documents describe the agency's thinking on a regulatory issue. FDA follows good guidance practice regulations to issue guidance, which is not legally binding on the public or FDA. And these documents can be found on FDA's website. Now, navigating the CFR can be a bit tricky if you've never done it. A searchable version of the CFR can be found online. And here is an example regulation from the CFR. Title 21 is the section for food and drugs. In this example, this substance is listed under Chapter 1 for FDA and Subchapter B for food for human consumption. Part 184 is for direct food substances affirmed as generally recognized as safe. This substance is also listed under Subpart B for specific substances affirmed as GRAS. Section 1195 is the listing for calcium citrate, which is a substance approved for use in infant formula. And here's how it looks in the CFR, where you can read the regulation for details. Now I'll discuss food additives and GRAS. Per Section 201S of the FD&C Act, a food additive is defined as any substance the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result directly or indirectly in its becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of a food, including any substance intended for use in producing, manufacturing, packing, processing, preparing, treating, packaging, transporting, or holding food, and including any source of radiation intended for any such use. As the purpose of the legal definition of food additive is to impose a pre-market approval requirement, there are several exceptions to this definition. This definition excludes ingredients that are prior sanctioned, or in other words, were approved for use by FDA or the U.S. Department of Agriculture prior to the food additive provisions of the law. Additionally, pesticides, animal drugs, dietary ingredients and dietary supplements, and color additives are excluded, as other legal pre-market approval requirements apply to these. Now, within the food additive definition is the GRAS provision, unless the use of the substance is generally recognized as safe. Under the FD&C Act, food ingredients may either be food additives or GRAS. In defining a food additive, Congress made it clear that the agency should not devote resources to evaluating substances for which there is expert consensus about the safe use of a food ingredient. This concept is also discussed in the CFR. To address this, Congress added a provision within the food additive definition accepting a substance if it is generally recognized among qualified experts as having been adequately shown to be safe under the conditions of its intended use. Note that it's the use of the ingredient, not the ingredient itself, that's GRAS. A conclusion of GRAS can be based on either scientific procedures or common use in food before 1958. Scientific procedures is based upon the application of generally available and accepted scientific data, information, or methods, which ordinarily are published, as well as the application of scientific principles and may be corroborated by the application of unpublished scientific data, information, or methods. A basis on common use in food before 1958 was used as a grandfathering mechanism, but it's not a typical path to GRAS anymore. It requires a substantial history of consumption for the same food use by a significant number of consumers. This pathway has rarely been successful as a means of demonstrating GRAS status, and most GRAS conclusions that we've seen are based on scientific procedures. The FD&C Act dictates that FDA must approve the use of both direct and indirect food additives. This may include a food additive regulation or an amendment to an existing food additive regulation, demonstrating that new uses have been developed or old uses abandoned. Examples of direct food additives include thickeners and preservatives. While indirect food additives or food contact substances won't be discussed today, some examples are bottle coatings and adhesives, including packaging for infant formula. Indirect additives and food contact substances are handled through our Food Contact Notification Program. We are having an upcoming webinar on food contact substances and infant formula packaging. Now, a substance's use meets the GRAS criteria does not require pre-market approval by FDA, as the use of an ingredient is GRAS because of widespread knowledge among a community of qualified experts, not because of a listing or other administrative activity. FDA evaluates GRAS conclusions through its GRAS notification program, where anyone can notify FDA of their conclusion that a substance is GRAS under its conditions of use through a GRAS notice, which may result in a no questions letter, but not an approval from FDA. It's important to note that neither food additive regulations nor GRAS notices are licenses. This means that anyone who complies with the terms of the regulation or the uses, specifications, or identity in a GRAS conclusion also may be covered without needing to come to FDA for further authorization. The evaluation standard and safety standard for food additives and GRAS substances are the same, which means that the evaluation process must address all the data and information, including what's in the literature or otherwise available, and there is a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. However, GRAS has an additional requirement, in that the safety data and information must be generally recognized as safe. Safety data and information included in a GRAS conclusion cannot be confidential. Additionally, the information supporting safety must be generally available and generally accepted by qualified scientific experts. But evidence of general acceptance is not a substitute for evidence of safety. If a substance directly added to food is not an approved food or color additive or is prior sanctioned, then its use may be GRAS provided the GRAS criteria are met. Finally, notifying FDA of a GRAS conclusion is optional, but meeting the GRAS provisions of the Act is mandatory. As I mentioned, the evaluation standard and safety standard for food additives and GRAS substances are the same. requiring the same quantity and quality of scientific evidence, while GRAS has the additional requirement of general recognition of safety, meaning that the safety data must be generally available and generally accepted and cannot be confidential. Availability is usually demonstrated by publicly available publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals, textbooks, scientific reports, etc. There are multiple ways to provide evidence of general acceptance, which is usually demonstrated through the peer review process of a respected scientific journal. However, we understand that many stakeholders look to GRAS panels as a means to provide evidence of general acceptance. We view the general acceptance element of general recognition as the key area where a GRAS panel's conclusion could provide substantive evidence. A GRAS panel is only one such way, and it may be redundant or unnecessary in cases where there is better evidence to support a conclusion of general acceptance. Where there is not available evidence of safety for the intended use, a panel's conclusion cannot confer GRAS status. Where there is substantial controversy in the scientific community, a panel's conclusion cannot confer GRAS status. However, in some cases, where there are certain ambiguities or nuances in interpretation of data, a properly constituted and run panel can provide evidence of general acceptance of those interpretations among the relevant scientific communities. But in the majority of cases, published, peer-reviewed scientific literature is sufficient to demonstrate consensus, and convening a GRAS panel is not necessary. The link to our guidance for industry, best practices for convening a GRAS panel is shown here. I want to briefly mention how food additive petitions for amending the regulations are reviewed, as the focus of the remainder of this talk will be on GRAS. Section 409 of the Act established pre-market approval requirements for food additives and a process for submitting food additive petitions found in Parts 170 and 171 of the CFR. To market a new food additive, or before using an approved food additive for a new use, a manufacturer must submit a petition proposing either a regulation prescribing the conditions under which the food additive may be safely used, or an amendment of an existing food additive regulation, which in either case ultimately results in a regulation published in the CFR. When evaluating the safety of ingredients added to food, FDA considers the identity and composition of the ingredient, the intended use and the amount that would be typically consumed, immediate long-term health effects, and various safety data and information demonstrating a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from the proposed conditions of use. To achieve the review standard of reasonable certainty of no harm, we evaluate a food additive petition with a multidisciplinary team of scientists, utilizing expertise throughout the agency as needed. The types of data and information required in petitions, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the review team, are listed here. The chemist is responsible for evaluating the identity, technical effect, manufacturing method, specifications, and dietary exposure. The toxicologist evaluates safety studies, proposed tolerances, or other limitations. An environmental scientist ensures that the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act are met. And other subject matter experts are included as needed, such as a microbiologist or members of the infant formula and medical food staff should use in infant formula be included in the petition. The review process is managed and coordinated by a regulatory review scientist who provides secondary review and ensures that all statutory deadlines and requirements are met. Next, I'll walk you through a brief history of the GRAS notification program and how we evaluate GRAS notices. Though the program is optional, manufacturers are encouraged to submit notices to our program. One key benefit of coming through our program is that the manufacturer receives a letter from FDA. We believe that FDA's response has value in marketing the substance and helps ensure consumer confidence. By 1961, FDA had amended its regulations in Part 182 to include a list of food substances that are GRAS under certain conditions of use, known as the GRAS list, which is based on common use in food prior to 1958. However, it was impracticable to list all GRAS substances. During the 1960s, many manufacturers requested FDA's opinion on whether their GRAS conclusions were justified, and they received opinion letters from us. In 1969, then President Nixon directed FDA to re-examine the safety of GRAS substances, which led to the development of the Select Committee on GRAS Substances, or SCOGS. In the 1970s, FDA announced that it was conducting a comprehensive review of presumed GRAS substances and established rulemaking procedures to affirm the GRAS status of substances that were either on the GRAS list or the subject of a petition. Basically, if the evaluation confirmed that the use of a particular substance was GRAS, FDA would issue a new GRAS regulation affirming that finding. Ingredients that were part of the agency-initiated comprehensive review or those that were the subject of a GRAS affirmation petition resulted in a formal regulation in Parts 184 and 186. To eliminate the resource-intensive rulemaking procedures, in 1997, FDA proposed to replace the GRAS affirmation petition process with a notification procedure. After operating under this pilot program since 1997, the GRAS final rule published in 2016 and the implementing regulations are found in 21 CFR Part 170 Subpart E. We also publish guidance on the regulatory framework for substances intended for use in human foods or animal feed on a basis of GRAS. The link to that guidance document is shown here. After making a conclusion that the use of their food ingredient is GRAS, a manufacturer may choose to submit a GRAS notice to FDA. We strongly encourage companies to request a pre-submission meeting prior to submitting a notice so they have a chance to meet with our team and ask questions beforehand. After receiving a GRAS notice submission, FDA conducts a pre-filing evaluation to determine if it meets the criteria for filing. If all the necessary filing requirements are met, FDA then files the notice, which starts the evaluation clock. Approximately 45 days after filing, the evaluation team meets to discuss whether the notice has provided a sufficient basis for a GRAS conclusion, or if the information in the notice or elsewhere raises questions about whether the use of the substance is GRAS. If more information is required, FDA sends questions to the notifier, who then addresses them through an amendment to the notice. FDA has established regulatory timeframes for responding to GRAS notices of 180 days, with the option to extend by an additional 90 days. We acknowledge these timelines can shift based on a number of factors. Whether or not a manufacturer chooses to submit a GRAS notice to FDA, the Act requires that they do the work to ensure that their use of the substance meets the same GRAS requirements prior to marketing their food ingredient. We advise that companies follow the GRAS documentation procedures laid out in the GRAS final rule and 21 CFR Part 170 Subpart E, even if they don't submit a notice to FDA. Any questions about food ingredient regulation and GRAS can be sent to our pre-market email inbox shown here. The GRAS final rule brought about new formatting changes and requirements to GRAS notices. There are 7 parts to a GRAS notice. Part 1 is the signed statements and certification. This includes contact information, the substance name, intended conditions of use, basis for the GRAS conclusion, that data will be made available to FDA, and whether there's any confidential information, and that it's a balanced notice, meaning the notice contains a fair representation of the totality of the data. Part 2 is basically the chemistry section. This includes the chemical name, CAS number, chemical formula, and characteristic properties. If the ingredient is a biological material, then this identifies the taxonomic source, part of the plant or animal, known toxicants, the method of manufacture, food grade specifications, and a demonstration of safety when necessary. Part 3 is the dietary exposure, or the amount of relevant substances likely to be consumed, including other sources and byproducts. This part must include the source of food consumption data and explain any assumptions made to estimate dietary exposure. Part 4 is the self-limiting levels of use, meaning the limit to the amount used due to unpalatability or technological impracticality. Part 5 is noting if the GRAS conclusion is based on common use in food before 1958, which would involve providing evidence of a substantial history of consumption for the intended use. This is rarely used as a basis anymore. Part 6 is the safety narrative. This part should include all dietary sources and chemically related substances in the diet. The notifier should show which data are generally available and which are not to the public, and explain how this generally available data supports the safety of the intended use and how it's viewed by qualified experts. This part should also discuss data that does not support the GRAS conclusion. Part 7 is the list of all data discussed, which should specify which data are generally available or not. If any part is not applicable, then an explanation of why that's the case needs to be provided. I want to reiterate that a GRAS panel is not required for a GRAS notice, and in most cases, a panel is not needed to demonstrate consensus on the safety of the use of a food ingredient. The link for information on the GRAS notification program is shown here. As with petitions, we evaluate a GRAS notice using a multidisciplinary team of scientists. The types of data and information required in a GRAS notice, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the evaluation team, are listed here. The chemist is responsible for evaluating the identity, manufacturing methods, specifications, and dietary exposure, while the toxicologist evaluates publicly available safety studies and other available information. Other subject matter experts are included as needed, such as a microbiologist or medical officer. Uses in infant formula or in foods under USDA's jurisdiction would include members of FDA's infant formula and medical food staff or USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. The evaluation process is managed and coordinated by a regulatory review scientist who provides secondary review and ensures that all deadlines and requirements are met. Once FDA has evaluated a GRAS notice, the agency may provide one of 3 types of responses. A successful notice is one in which FDA has no questions about the basis of the notifier's GRAS conclusion. Please note this does not constitute an approval. However, some notices have been unsuccessful. In these cases, the notice does not provide a sufficient basis for a GRAS conclusion. And a third possibility is that the notifier can stop the process. For the majority of notices that we've evaluated, FDA has responded with no questions letters. Please note that some GRAS ingredients may also require a color additive approval and regulation if they impart color. Our letters, along with the GRAS notices and amendments, are posted on our online inventory, which can be found at this link. When evaluating the safety of ingredients added to food, FDA considers the identity and composition of the ingredient, the intended use and the amount that would be typically consumed, meaning the dietary exposure, the properties of the substance that could impact immediate and long-term health effects, and various safety data and information demonstrating a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from the proposed conditions of use. Data and study endpoints must reflect the evidence of safety. So they must be appropriate for all target populations, must be appropriate considering known and suspected modes of action, and be appropriate with consideration of dietary exposure. So in other words, a 90-day oral toxicity rat study may not provide sufficient evidence of safety in all cases. One point that is sometimes overlooked is that GRAS is time-dependent. If new evidence suggests that an ingredient in use may be unsafe, FDA also has post-market authority under the FD&C Act to find that the use of the ingredient is no longer GRAS and is thus an unsafe food additive. FDA may take action such as issuing warning letters. As the use of a substance evolves, evidence in support of a GRAS conclusion may grow weaker or stronger. I'll finish up by discussing some of the special considerations we take into account when food ingredients have uses in infant formula. 21 CFR 10640A states that the only substances that may be used in an infant formula are substances that are safe and suitable for use in infant formula under the applicable food safety provisions of the FD&C Act. That is, a substance is used in accordance with FDA's food additive regulations, is GRAS for use in infant formula, or is authorized by a prior sanction. So if an ingredient is GRAS for use in baked goods, that does not automatically mean it is GRAS for use in infant formula. Applicable regulations and a link to the GRAS notice inventory are shown here. Since GRAS conclusions are not licenses, a different supplier than the notifier of the GRAS notice may be used when manufacturing the final infant formula. In those cases, additional information may be asked for during the infant formula submission process administered by the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling. Such information confirming the identity of the ingredient, use levels, specifications, and manufacturing method. When evaluating a GRAS notice for an ingredient intended for use in infant formula, our colleagues from IFMFS are included as part of the GRAS notice evaluation team and are asked to lend their expertise as needed. Some things we look for in an infant formula GRAS notice include the formula type. Is it non-exempt or exempt? The intended infant population, such as term or preterm. The intended formula protein base, such as milk, soy, partially hydrolyzed, or amino acid based. Are there appropriate specifications, such as for microorganisms like Chronobacter sakazakii or Salmonella? Use level and exposure estimates. Publicly available studies showing the safety of the ingredient's use by the intended population. So were the studies done in term or preterm infants rather than adults? And a comparison to normal constituents in human milk, which the notifier should discuss the similarities and differences in the notice. This concludes the presentation portion of the webinar, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Morissette. At this time, we'll begin the question and answer portion of the webinar and answer several of the questions we received during the webinar registration process. As we cannot get into all of the questions that were submitted, we will answer the most frequently asked questions along with any clarifying questions. All right, so Dr. Morissette, the first question is, if an ingredient is safe to use in infant formulas, is it safe to use in other conventional foods?
In the webinar, I discussed the GRAS provision within the food additive definition, which accepts the substance from the pre-market approval requirements of a food additive if the substance is generally recognized among qualified experts as having been adequately shown to be safe under the conditions of its intended use. This means that it's the use of the ingredient, not the ingredient itself, that's GRAS. So if an ingredient is GRAS for use in infant formula, that does not automatically mean it is GRAS for use in baked goods, for example, or other conventional foods. The intended use would need to state the specific conventional foods for their use to be GRAS.
All right, next question. Does a GRAS conclusion for infant formula cover all formulas?
No, a GRAS conclusion for infant formula does not cover all formulas. As I mentioned earlier, a GRAS conclusion covers the specific intended use of an ingredient. Additionally, infant formulas are regulated according to how they are used and by the infant populations who are consuming them. So GRAS conclusion for use of an ingredient in non-exempt infant formula for term infants, for example, would not cover the use of that ingredient in an exempt infant formula for preterm infants. The data and information supporting the safety of the intended use, including the dietary exposure and the safety narrative included in Part 6 of the GRAS notice, must be pertinent to the intended infant population consuming that ingredient.
Is a GRAS panel required for a GRAS notice?
No, a GRAS panel is not a required part of a GRAS notice. A GRAS panel is only one mechanism that can be used to fulfill the requirements of a general acceptance element of general recognition of safety in a GRAS conclusion. A GRAS panel may be redundant or unnecessary in cases where there is already evidence to support a conclusion of general acceptance, and a panel may not be appropriate in cases where evidence of safety does not exist or where the science is unsettled in the scientific community. While there are limited instances where a panel may be useful, in the majority of cases, published peer-reviewed scientific literature is sufficient to demonstrate consensus, and convening a GRAS panel is not necessary.
Here's our last question. How can I improve the chances of my GRAS submission being filed?
Before making a submission to our GRAS notification program, we strongly encourage companies to request a pre-submission meeting so they have a chance to meet with our experts and ask questions about the contents of a proposed notice beforehand. A pre-submission meeting can be requested by emailing our pre-market inbox. Once we receive a meeting request, we assemble a team of appropriate subject matter experts to attend and work to schedule that meeting with the requester. We ask that any materials the requester wishes FDA to review beforehand, such as presentation slides, be provided at least 3 weeks prior to the meeting. Please note that we cannot review draft GRAS notices in their entirety but we can't provide feedback on specific small sections or text. Also, please be mindful about any materials that you provide to us, as they may be subject to release under the Freedom of Information Act or FOIA. We also encourage companies to browse our searchable online GRAS notice inventory for successful GRAS notices for similar ingredients that may be referred to or used as a template when putting together your notice. It's important to look at the amendments to those GRAS notices as well, as they often contain relevant information that contributed to the GRAS conclusion and a successful outcome. While the amendments for our newer notices are posted in the inventory, you will need to submit a FOIA request to access the older notice amendments. I want to emphasize that your chances of having your GRAS notice filed are greatly improved if the notice is properly assembled and well-written. A well-written GRAS notice helps to ensure that both the filing and evaluation processes go as smoothly as possible.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hansen, and thank you, Dr. Merced. As a reminder, the next webinar in the series is June 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will focus on U.S. regulation of food contact substances and considerations for infant formula packaging. If you haven't already, please register to attend the webinar series. For your convenience, the registration link to the webinar series is located in the YouTube box description below. One registration provides access to both webinars. Links to resources that were shared during today's presentations are available on the screen and also available in the YouTube description box as well. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on the FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and goodbye.